Ultra is charging very slow today. I wanted to get this out before I became too arcane, too esoteric, to where I could no longer interpret this into a more temporal, carnal manifestation, right? I.e., how we shape ourselves, the idea of self, the self conceptualization. You can see I'm starting to slip away here. So before I go on to my other channels, before I put something up that's deemed on the arcane and then full on esoteric, where I have to go into my other channel, I run 3 channels and have a very successful site linked up with my first channel, which is based upon principles. And so everything, so I'm not losing you here, I'm getting to the point, is that everything is based on principles and principle protocol. You know, Nietzsche said that he hated systems, right? Yet there he was studying the ontology and the epistemology of times, places, things, and events. We can't get away from it, right? But it really gets into other philosophers recognizing wealth, built, Weltanschauung, right? Weltanschauung Krieg, like your world, your worldview, how you see things, right? Perception, and even more so this parallax view, which really gets into and correlates toward what I'm discussing here, which is, you know, these various nutritional methods and modes, right? And how it seems like there's a complete guise of perception. Like I put up a comment if people on Tristan Lee, right, saying he didn't eat enough. That's why he went off carnivore, right? And then somebody pipes in and says a comment underneath mine saying he was eating 4,000 calories a day. Look, when you are eating carnivore, you have to be willing to eat 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 calories a day. Look at the calories that a professional athlete takes in. Ask yourself how much you want it, how much you want to drive, right? But I'm not supporting carnivore here. Neither am I speaking against it. What I'm saying is we need new terminologies in the field, right? Things should be based specifically on non-speculative, all-encompassing terms, right? So, in other words, for me to say that you should add beef liver into your daily diet and never miss a day, right? And if you have to cut back so that you're not overdoing it on the vitamin A, the iron, the copper, right? And CQ10 to a much lesser extent, along with selenium and zinc. I mean, it's got everything, vitamin Bs, right? Instead of eating 1/8 of a pound a day, cut that down to a 1/16, right? It'll just cost you less money to be able to eat that way and get high quality nutrients in. But the better way to look at it is to give your body what it needs to assimilate the entirety, right, of the nutrient profile, and then go into what I consider orthomolecular prompts, which leads directly into gluconeogenesis, and that is what Tristan Lee is missing. He's missing the understanding of a multifarious complex, and he's young, right? And I can tell that he's interested in this, right? But there are very few people out there right now, and that's why I'm meeting this niche. That's why I'm stepping forward. I'm an INTJ on the Keirsey temperament scale. I don't step up until everybody in the room is basically evading the subject, and that's why I'm stepping up right now, you know? And so I'm coming out of the shadows. And I went through a very similar thing as Tristan Lee last year. I had gained a shit ton of weight. The weight that I typically go into, whether I'm training and just eating adequate calories, but not necessarily looking at my diet, I weigh 205. That's what I got up to. I went from close to 150 pounds up to 205. I could put on another 50 pounds and go up to 250. That's kind of like my range. I have this 100-pound range where I could go up 50 pounds, I could go down 50 pounds, you know? But to really strain that and push it toward that next level, that's where you go through this transformative process with your training, right? That if I was getting up to 250 and I wanted to go into like more strongman type activities, right? That would invariably create the prompt, the need to go up in body weight and to use full body power movements, right? To go completely anaerobic and develop my aerobic conditioning through anaerobic mechanisms. So it could be said that you would do just the opposite, right? To get down functionally into lower body weights. But what we see is powerlifters prove that that's not so, right? So it really, I guess what I'm saying is it's nutrition and it's diet alone. So for me to say that whether I weigh 150 pounds or 250 pounds, or above 250 pounds or below 150 pounds, right? Where I would be doing like more cycling, right? I might be taking in the same number of calories, right? So it really comes down to, you could say, most people would chime in and say anabolics, right? But you can achieve this sort of anabolic mechanism without going into the world of PEDs, which I'm very well versed in, and I try to stay away from that subject entirely. But if it was brought out and people wanted to discuss it in a very professional, formatted way, in an intellectual conversation, I would gratify that, because I have a lot to offer in that world. But I prefer to stay with what I adhere to, what I recognize, and what I really am a proponent of, and that is orthomolecular nutrition at the base, um, understanding your body and the phasic responses, but mainly getting in enough, right, of these nutritional constants at a base, which I got into earlier. So the number one thing, in my opinion, is to make sure you're eating beef liver. And I'm not sure I've heard Tristan Lee ever talk about that or discuss it. The second thing is to make sure you're getting in sardines every single day, right? So this is where you might opt in if you're going more for power movements with more of a fatty fish like a salmon, right? It really comes down to how much money you want to spend and how many times you want to eat, how many calories you're taking in, and what your training protocol is. But it's not so much the training as I was discussing, but what you're doing in between. Like right now, I'm doing long, slow distance walking, right? Your average power lifter is going to be spending and consuming a huge amount of time just sitting, right? But because of those ketone bodies, if they're more carnivorously based, right, their brains are going to be wired, right? They're going to be sitting on that computer, right? And just like I'm able to utilize technology, and while I'm walking, doing long, slow distance, so I go into this long, slow distance exercise protocol when I want to lose body fat. And for me, it's more important at 50, almost 56 years old, to do this every single day than it is for me to try and pack on from where I am right now. That would be like a 70-pound gain. Because even though I got up to 205, I'm now down to like 183, right? And these types of shifts, you could say, oh, those are drastic. But what I would like to contend is the fact that when you look at your chronobiology, when you look at the phasic cycle that you go through in a day, in a week, well, when you get into Elson Haas and his writings with staying healthy with nutrition, staying healthy with the seasons, which he's done much more writing, right? But these are the central tenets, in my opinion, to his work, because it shows you that there is a time when you would eat heartier, you might eat eggplant. You're eating more cruciferous style vegetables. You're eating the foods that have the resilience, right? And you're going to be eating more stews and meats and so forth. In the summertime, you're physically shifting toward lighter foods, low density foods, right? Even more catabolic foods to stay hydrated, right? And so people are all confused about this right now. Like in the summertime, that's when you eat your apples. That's when you eat your blueberries. That's when you take in your pineapple, when they're available, right? And so I'm not saying that you have to eat these foods, because the beauty about carnivore is that it proves, right, that you can get all your nutrients in at a much lower cost, and maybe even in a preferred sort of way, right? I don't like to create this bumping against or this competition between the two fields, because literally you have the field that the cows graze on, that gets into the fit for life concept where they're taking in grass all day, but they have four stomachs, lots of copper, lots of chlorophyll. You can see it in their liver, right? And then you look at the field and you're like, it's kind of this Cain and Abel thing, right? Then you look at the field and all the bounty exists there in the wheat fields and the barley, right? And Clarence Bass, one of the leanest people to ever walk the face of the earth, the most shredded, you could see the guy, I mean, he stayed like that for years, right? Is a big proponent for power meals that consist of like I said, barley. You might eat quinoa, right? Lots of beans and so forth, right? In these stews where you're, power meals in the past, like you could create a really cheap power meal by throwing an entire bag of lettuce, right? you would do a whole bag of radicchio type lettuce or dark leafy greens, but then you would throw in some of the cheap stuff also just as roughage to take up the space. So your body has to go through the metabolic process. So, essentially you're just eating these catabolic foods and you're getting a workout from the meal. You follow? So then you would put in what would be next? Corn, right? You'd put in a really high quality can of corn packed in water, right? Without any added sugars. Same thing with beans. You might put a whole can of kidney beans and a whole can of something that would complement that, like a black bean, right? You might throw in some fresh organic salsa. And if you could stand it and you want to throw it in just to balance everything out, you might want to throw in some mangoes and some apples, right? Diced up really small. And then you would add in like a really high quality vinegar, but no oil, right? Type of a dressing, right? That would aid your digestion, where you get a little bit more into Chinese and even Indian medicines, where you might even, focus in on a little curry, maybe a little, a spiciness, but you don't want to go too much. The whole point is that you're allowing the foods uninterrupted to go to work for themselves to create this catabolic effect, right? And so you're going to be full, right? You're going to be full, and your body's going to be busy processing this. And obviously, this is going to make you have some amazing bowel movements right after that. But this is where super compensation comes into place, right? Where if you feel like you're taking in enough nutrients and you don't need to super compensate with nutrient dense foods, which is all part of the protocol that I talk about over and over again, right? Because it's how you're going to maintain and even prosper and add on, right? Leanness, definition, power output, higher performance, right? When you do go through that transition where there's just no way you can eat that much meat. Now, for some people, they can. And what I would recommend doing on the carnivore side is begin to blend pastes together. If you could almost picture like a liverwurst, right? And for some people, this makes people gag, right? Where they would be able to take enough beef liver, enough sardines, enough eggs, maybe, depending on how fast you want to eat it, or if you want to freeze it. I wouldn't recommend putting the eggs in with it, right? And maybe a really high quality fatty steak, and you would put it through like a processor, or you would just blend it all together, right? And you could actually use this as kind of a paste where you're adding additional calories and additional nutrients onto something that's already really calorie dense, such as you create a paste. You could put it palatably, the texture to provisionally towards something that, almost in like this puree type state, like a liverwurst, where you could just put a little bit on the side, or, lather that up over a steak, right? Or whatnot. So you're always getting complete meals in every single time, right? This is when you're really bumping up your calories, but you want to gauge the nutrients you're taking in, right? You want to know that you're not taking in too much of particular nutrients is the point here. Well, the same thing could be done. I used to, when I was reading Staying Healthy with Nutrition, but mainly breaking off from Elson Hawes and focusing on Billy J. Saley, when I was reading Heal with Amino Acids and Nutrients and prescribing, right, this sort of plan toward my clients at the time, saying, this is how you, prescription might be a heavy word. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I was, I had a few nutrition and wellness certifications at that time, and I had several in sports conditioning and many others, from NASM to NSCA to AFA to ACE. I had them all, right? I had all these certifications, and I would read the book more than once. I would actually go through it, and then I would study the recommended literature that was linked up to the books, right? So I was really doing diligence to stay informed and to be able to inform my clients. So that if I had clients that had a higher level of understanding, or I had a more of a beginning client, right, I could convey the information so that if people wanted to go do the research for themselves, they could, right? And if they wanted to go really deep into the research, they could, right? Just by referencing these individuals and seeing where their cited materials came from. But I came up with this sludge, right, that would have all the nutrients. So I had an AM sludge, I had a PM sludge, right? And what I found is there's just no way you're going to be able to replace all your meals with this sludge. Like, there's windows, there's times where your body just needs to digest, go through gastric emptying, right? And that holds true on carnivore, as well as, if you're eating a more holistic, even vegan or vegetarian type approach, right? Which you can do either. It's just, do you have the type of disposable income and the money to be able to prep and provide these nutrients from a vegetable type source? I mean, it's you can do it, but it's going to take quite a bit of eating. And in fact, a lot of times you're going to be eating a good 1,000 to 1,500 calories more than you would on a carnivore diet, just because most of that is, there's going to be so much fiber and so much roughage and so many catabolic foods, right, that your metabolism is just going to be going nuts. But you're going to see amazing results, right? And so the book that I would recommend reading is, again, Staying Healthy with Nutrition. And then he also wrote a book back in the day called Staying Healthy with the Seasons. That's a very amazing accompaniment to that, right? Heal with Amino Acids and Nutrients by Billy J. Saley. A really good intro, but there's so much more that's known about the world of amino acids. And she was a huge pioneer in PTSD. She was one of the people on the President's Council for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. In fact, she was one of the people that named and coined that phrase, right? And it's too bad she's not talked about much. And then we need to give credit where credit is due to Linus Pauling, because if he would have been as caustic and aggressive getting his message out as someone like Jack Cruz, right? A neurosurgeon, right? Where a lot of he seems so combative and so argumentative, but at the same time, if you saw somebody like Linus Pauling, I'm going to crack my back real quick, that had that sort of fervor and aggressiveness. Let's pop it. Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of rolfing and shaping myself while I'm walking. So if you had somebody with that much fervor and that much knowledge, right, that was approaching this thing where they realized that the assault and the guardians at the gate are trying to keep this information from coming out, and then you also see how long it's been going on. If you're able to ignite yourself, with all the fires and the powers, I love Jason Reza Georgiani, Michael Tassarian, right? So like this Promethean sort of ignition, right? Where you're coming out with this fire and you're saying, look at how long this has been happening. These people are trying to kill me, right? This is big pharma. This is the government. This is, right? And this isn't some conspiracy theorist speculation. Like, if you follow along with it, you're going to end up like my uncle, who just died of congestive heart failure, right? Where he had to follow along to the VA when the VA was telling him, you're diabetic, So he started taking insulin, right? He didn't really need to, in my opinion. right? He could have gone around that, learning to control his insulin, eating insulin sensitively, right? Not combining. This is a very crude, abstract, but trying not to combine, at least for a little while, to learn how to put these back together. Separating carbohydrates from fats will lead you directly toward becoming more insulin sensitive. But of course, that's a very gray area, because you, just like fats, you know, you have your fatty acids, right? Then you have your like medium chain triglycerides, and then it gets into eating, you know, beef tallow and beef fats, and you have to kind of use those as a tool to understand when to create the most type of blunting, right? In other words, you're trying to keep your insulin spikes down and stay out of gluconeogenesis. Well, down the road, you're going to use gluconeogenesis to your benefit, right? And it's very important to understand those transitions, right? And how to get, especially if you're trying to come up with a product like Tristan Lee is, where you're really wanting to look super diced, super ripped, right? But to be able to cycle this through, I don't think he understands the cycling very well. And it's not to speak against him or to speak down on him. He's very young still, right? But it's to say that I think he's looking for a holistic equilibrium that doesn't seem to exist, and we use it in this idealistic sort of way. And as you get older, you realize that there's a flux and a play that exists universally with everything, everywhere, all the time, right? So, you know, you have people who look at the zodiac or zodiacal or calendric type cycles, and they don't see how this ties into stuff that Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock talk about, right? And many others. But when you really see it all, your diet becomes evident and clear to you, especially based around your personality traits and when you came into the world, right? So you don't have to jump toward this woo-woo white lighter. This is science. Like, you know, when you look into Zoroastrianism, referencing Jason Georgiani again, right? Jason Reza Georgiani, and even Michael Tessarian to a great extent, right? You begin to look at the fact that these cycles that I spoke of earlier, that, you know, really, like for me, I gained a lot of weight in the wintertime, for instance. Now that it's summertime, I'm dropping all that weight. So you could say that I didn't really blow it. I was actually trying to reset. I felt this intrinsic need to reset my system. And instead of working against that next winter, I will probably switch the type of foods that I'm eating that will allow me to pack on 15, maybe 20 pounds, right? But it's not just going to be fat, right? It's going to be training, my training protocols, my training mechanism. In other words, I'll cut back on the walking because of the cold weather, right? Is going to prompt my metabolism as it is. So where I would drink more ice water in the summertime, I might have more hot water, hot teas, hot beverages during the wintertime. Does that make sense? So I might eat, you know, more hearty stews and things like that. And I don't need to break off from carnivore in order to do that, right? There's a lot of ways that we can do this. And we can add in spices, right? We can add in more of a Ayurvedic type medicine approach also. And so this is where I want to get away from the terms using carnivore and going, look, as long as you're taking in beef liver, as long as you're taking in, if you're coming from a vegan or, you know, vegetarian perspective, that's another thing. You're going to have to piece that together. It usually will start with dark leafy greens and so forth and go on from there. And then you have the benefits of a lot of chlorophyll and things like this, right? But the same could hold true with when you get into eating even more organs, right? Even more organ meats and things like this of a specific order, where you might even get into what used to be termed like bovine serum, where you're actually eating derivatives of the animal's blood system, or, you know, taking in raw milk, right? Farm fresh raw milk, raw dairy eggs. So that might be something you focus on more in the wintertime, as you know, somebody who terms yourself carnivore, you follow? You might want to go right to the source and start taking in the really holistic, freshly butchered and freshly collected items like eggs and milk and so forth, right? And so sardines should be next on that list, right? Possibly even cod liver oil. And then you get into something that's flexible, whether it's winter, you know, or summer, but you could also look at like a lamb, right? Where you can get into, or venison, where you're combining certain meats that have certain profiles that are more beneficial at certain times throughout the year. I'm sure that begins to make some sense to people, right? Where you're focusing on the entire animal and even cartilage to a greater extent, right? And then you get into eggs, where you might eat a higher number of eggs during the summertime, where you're not focusing on the necessary protocol of having to take in high omega fat, high omega rich eggs, right? But you're taking in plenty of omegas. That's why we take in the sardines. That's why we're eating the eggs, right? So you're not eating necessarily low in omega-3s, but you might want to bolster that up during the wintertime where you're taking in even higher amounts. And then, you know, linoleic acid and so forth, right? You can get into when you would take those in and the enzymatic breakdown process, right? And then ketones, right? There are certain firewalls, and I would even say that supercompensation from vegetable sources, obviously going into glycolysis, act as a firewall. But on the same level, when you're getting into acetone and you're getting into, you know, staying in ketosis for long stints of time, long periods of time, there are walls there where people like Tristan Lee, probably after about 2.5 to 3 months on strict carnivore, where he's making no concessions, that might be when he kind of pulls back and away from that, putting on a little bit more weight, right? Putting on a little bit more fat weight to where he's comfortable, but then being able to be metabolically flexible. So there's a lot of research being done right now where they actually have come out with what they term beige fat, right? That's a combination of, and this was for cancer research, but you can see the applications of this, right? That are immense, that you combine brown fat and white fat together and they come out with something called beige fat. It could be something where your body doesn't even really cling on to this, but then, you know, when we're talking about this transhumanistic effect, where we are going through a rapid evolutionary process set by technology, right? Even when we're talking about the Internet of Bodies, and I'm not going to trail off here, but it's pertinent to us through fitness, nutrition, and even, you know, getting into religious sciences, where, you know, you could continue to follow certain principles, never breaking off of your religious beliefs, and even bolstering your religious beliefs so that you're bringing something to the show, right? You're showing that it can be done in a practical way, where now I'm moving with this, right? Now I'm turning what would be considered sort of almost like a stoicism. You know, you're considering this just a more solidified existential component that can't necessarily be put into energy work or what might be termed spiritual work, right? But in fact, it can be, right? And that's where you get into aromatic amino acids that kind of break off. Like, I'm not going to keep talking about this because I have, but it gets into consciousness studies, microtubules, how the eye is saturated with what are called aromatic amino acids, right? Particularly the hexamer rings, right? Where you have basically bioluminescence light that's trapped and absorbed and brought into your body system. And it's not a joke. Like, you could look at it, the old school studies on Zeitgebers, if you want to look into that. And then you could go on to Jack Kruse, Hammeroff, Penrose, and begin to look at the microtubule junction points of where supposed consciousness is taking place, and how crucial and fundamental these excitatory neurotransmitters like phenylalanine, these shifting, you know, these shifting histamine based, right? Work at, as an axis point, and then getting into dopamine and dopamine production more so with tyrosine, and then phasically shifting into a sleep and repair cycle that is heavily correlated toward collagen, the synthesis, the use, again with vitamin C, but B6, magnesium, right? Even GABA to some extent, you could add on to that list, where you're physically slipping in back to the aromatic amino acids with tyrosine or tryptophan, right? And you're producing obviously more dopamine, but then you're also going into this critical cortical steroid production phase that often people look past. And that's really the whole point to this long-winded conversation, soliloquy with myself here, right? As I'm walking, sipping on my second cup of coffee, can't you tell, right? And if you don't have the money, so I am going through this biohacking on a shoestring, just like I say. I spend under $300 a month because I have to. That's all I have. And I found that, wow, I can actually do this with Carnivore, right? So not only is it a financial potential and possibility to do this and to take in enough calories, right? But also when we look at doing things more on a hybrid level, which is becoming very popular these days, I'm trying to get people away from really using carnivore as a generalized over encompassing term, just like fruitarian or fruitarian, or more like vegan or vegetarian. It's like, let's get away from these terms and let's look at the constituents of the nutrients and the nutrient profile instead, right? Because when you get down to something in its holistic pure form, you begin to see how there's very little difference, right, between them. And there is a time to shift, there's a time to take them. So if you're working on your microbiome, you can still do that while you're eating meat. You might not call yourself a carnivore anymore, right? And so you get into all these other areas that really slip into the music industry, where it's like you have a billion names for different things, and that's just not true, right? It's just not true. The reason those phrases, even like, I'm part of the X generation, that's an author who created that term. Am I going to allow some author that's so obscure, through the trespass of time, dictate what I'm going to call myself, how I'm going to term myself, or what the definition, the index, the brackets are? No, I'm not, right? But what does it do? It gives a general compilation and indexing, right, to be able to understand and affirm from a statistical data set, right? And so from a scientific perspective, that's fine and dandy, right? But then once you get into the real world, you have to be able to look at the nutrient profile with these foods and to be able to know exactly what the right food is to eat at the right time, and how there's going to be this blending and phasing through these cycles, right? So I mentioned the beef liver, I mentioned the sardines, I mentioned the eggs, right? And I mentioned the chicken with the fat, right? Once you blend all these together, the only thing that's missing, and why I drink apple cider vinegar in my water, is because I'm really focusing on prepping and priming the microbiome, right? And there's plenty of people out there that'll argue with you and say, you can still have your microbiome, and there's a different process, but right. But then when your stomach feels a certain way, and what you could eat right now that would remedy that, right? And what's healthy and how it's not breaking protocol. So I am a big advocate for maybe supplementing in a little bit of really high, highly nutritious, really, let's just put it straight up, like fermented sauerkraut, right? Buying it as fresh as you possibly can, right? And then trying to figure out what that point is where, and this is, again, instead of thinking of things in a huge way, you might look at something that is so minuscule and tiny where you're just putting like a tablespoon's worth of a certain blend on the side of your dish just to make sure you're getting it. And you might, you might even throw like in probiotics in the same way. But when you're looking at the total calories that you're taking in, that's not even covering like 1% of your total calories. It's not going to take you out of ketosis. That's the whole point, that doing a G&G driven, right? When I talked earlier about that, how you're going to turn on the G&G and turn it back off, that is that switch. But you're going to need to have the denser sort of fats like the tallows and the butters and so forth, right? Or the chicken fat, the beef fat, right? So in order to, mediate that switch. So anyway, I am walking. I'm feeling great. I'm on my 10th day of just doing carnivore. I'm using the term because I'm sticking on the nutrition plan, but really, I guess, would you say I'm on carnivore if I'm drinking ACV, right? Would you say I'm on carnivore if I'm taking in EVOO, right? Because that's the only deviations that I'm taking, right? Would you say I'm on carnivore if I'm taking high dose orthomolecular vitamin C that I already had, 3,000 milligrams today, and I'm going to try to do 3,000 milligrams 3 to 4 times through the day, right? Can you really say that? Like if you were to go in and look at my metabolic function, my body doesn't really know the difference, right? My ketone levels are way up, right? So maybe that's where you gauge whether or not you're on carnivore, right? So I'm trying to get people to break away from these terms and really look at the nutrient density, the nutrient quality, and stop using generalized terms and really get into the sciences of eating what they need. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Rogue Beast Warrior out.